The fog was so thick that night, you couldn't see your own hand if you held it out in front of you. Highway 9 had disappeared. Not closed, disappeared. Swallowed whole by a wall of white so dense it turned headlights into useless yellow smears against nothing. The Pacific Ocean, less than a quarter mile to the west, pushed that fog inland like a living thing, filling every ditch, every curve, every gap between the trees until the entire coastal stretch became a place where the world simply stopped existing. It was 1:14 in the morning, November, cold enough that the moisture in the air bit into your skin and stayed there. And somewhere along that invisible road, past the Barrow Point turnoff, past the last street light, past the point where any reasonable person would have pulled over and waited for dawn, something terrible had already happened. A police cruiser sat nose down in a drainage ravine, its front end crumpled against a concrete culvert like a crushed aluminum can. The windshield had spiderwebbed and partially collapsed inward. Steam hissed from the ruptured engine block in thin, ghostly ribbons. The light bar on the roof was shattered, but the rear hazard lights still pulsed, faintly, weakly, amber flickers bleeding through the fog like the last heartbeat of something dying. And beside that wreck, half ejected from a door that had been wrenched open by the force of impact, a woman lay face down in blood-soaked gravel. Her uniform was torn. Her duty belt had been ripped partially away, equipment scattered in the mud around her like debris from an explosion. One arm was twisted beneath her body at an angle that no arm should ever make, and the blood, dark, almost black against the wet earth, pooled beneath her torso in a widening circle that the fog couldn't hide and the rain couldn't wash away fast enough. She was dying, alone, in the dark, on a road no one was driving. Most people, and I need you to be honest with yourself here, most people would never have been on that road in the first place. And the ones who were, they would have seen the faint amber pulse through the fog and driven past, too afraid, too late, too unsure, too convinced that it was someone else's problem, someone else's responsibility, someone else's life to save. But one set of headlights appeared that night. One battered pickup truck crawling through the white at 30 miles an hour. And behind the wheel was a man who had every reason in the world to keep driving, and not a single qualification to stop. He wasn't a paramedic. He wasn't a former soldier. He wasn't an off-duty officer or a trained first responder or anyone who had ever held a life in his hands before. He was a shipyard mechanic, a single father, a man running on 4 hours of sleep with grease permanently embedded in the creases of his palms, and an 8-year-old daughter asleep on a couch 14 miles away, waiting for him to come home. And the choice he made in the next 11 minutes didn't just save one life. It shook an entire police department to its foundation, brought 140 officers to their feet, and forced every single one of them to rethink everything they believed about what it means to be a hero. This is that story, and I promise you, you are not ready for how it ends. But before we go any further, if you believe that ordinary people are capable of extraordinary things, if you believe that one moment of courage can change everything, I need you to do something right now. Hit that like button, subscribe to this channel if you haven't already, and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from, because this story deserves to be heard by every single person who's ever wondered whether one person can truly make a difference. Now, let me take you back to where it all began. The night had started the way every night started for Marcus Delaney, with exhaustion so deep it lived in his bones. His shift at the Hargrove shipyard repair dock was supposed to end at 10. It didn't. A diesel engine rebuild on a commercial fishing vessel had gone sideways around 8:30. A cracked cylinder sleeve that nobody caught during the initial teardown, which meant pulling the entire block. Again, remeasuring tolerances, and starting from scratch with a foreman standing over his shoulder who didn't believe in overtime pay and didn't care that Marcus had been on his feet for 12 consecutive hours. By the time he clocked out, it was 11:40 p.m. His back screamed. His hands were so stiff from torquing bolts that his fingers curled involuntarily when he tried to relax them. He smelled like diesel fuel and sweat and the particular metallic tang of a man who had pushed his body past the point where it could politely ask him to stop. He climbed into his pickup, a 2009 Ford with 230,000 miles on it, a heater that worked when it felt like it, and a passenger seat permanently dusted with goldfish cracker crumbs from his daughter, and pointed it toward home. Home was a rented 2-bedroom house in Crestline, a small coastal town where the median income was just high enough to keep people working and just low enough to keep them worried. Marcus paid $1,400 a month for a place with drafty windows, a kitchen faucet that dripped no matter how hard you twisted it, and a backyard just big enough for a 7-year-old girl to run in circles until she was dizzy and laughing and everything wrong with the world temporarily didn't exist. That girl was Lily. And Lily was the reason for everything. She was the reason Marcus took shifts that left grease embedded so deep in his palms it never fully washed away. She was the reason he skipped lunches so there would always be enough for dinner. She was the reason he drove Highway 9 at 1 in the morning instead of pulling onto the shoulder and sleeping in the cab the way his body begged him to, because there was a babysitter at the house charging $12 an hour, and every hour past midnight was another hour he'd feel in his wallet for the rest of the week. Marcus Delaney was 34 years old. He had a bad back, calloused hands, and a heart held together almost entirely by his daughter's laughter. He wasn't remarkable by any measure. He didn't have a degree. He didn't have savings. He didn't have a 5-year plan or a social media presence or a single person in his life who would have described him as heroic. He was a man who packed school lunches with handwritten notes that Lily pretended to be embarrassed by, but secretly kept in a shoebox under her bed. He was a man who fell asleep in his recliner most nights with the television murmuring because the 12 steps to his bedroom felt like 12 miles. He was a man who had memorized every word of Lily's favorite bedtime story, not because he tried, but because he'd read it so many times the sentences had worn grooves into his brain like water cutting through stone. Ordinary, invisible, forgettable. But there was a wound beneath all of that, a fracture line running through his life that he never talked about, and Lily was too young to fully understand. 3 years ago, his wife Janine had left. Not dramatically, not with screaming or shattered dishes or the kind of explosive confrontation that gives you something to rage against. She left quietly. She sat down at the kitchen table on a Tuesday morning while Lily was at preschool, folded her hands in front of her like she was about to pray, and told Marcus she couldn't do it anymore. The bills, the exhaustion, the smallness of a life she had never chosen. She said it without cruelty, almost without emotion, as if she had rehearsed the words so many times they had lost their edges. She packed a single suitcase. She left her wedding ring on the kitchen counter beside Lily's stuffed rabbit, a worn floppy-eared thing named Captain Bun, as though the two objects held equal weight. Then she walked out the front door without looking back, and Marcus sat at that table for an hour afterward, not crying, not moving, barely breathing, just staring at the ring and the rabbit and trying to understand which loss would eventually hurt his daughter more. He never told Lily the full truth. He said, "Mama had to go somewhere far away. She loves you very much. Sometimes people leave not because you aren't enough, but because they're looking for something they lost inside themselves." Lily had nodded with the grave seriousness only a 4-year-old can manage, hugged Captain Bun tighter against her chest, and asked if they could have pancakes for dinner. They had pancakes that night, and the next Friday, and every Friday after that, because some rituals are lifelines disguised as breakfast food, and Marcus would rather cut off his own hand than take this one away from her. Now, 3 years later, Lily was 7. She had her mother's eyes, wide and dark and impossibly perceptive, and her father's stubbornness, which she wielded like a superpower. She made him laugh on days when laughter felt impossible. She crawled into his lap after the worst shifts and said, with the kind of certainty that only a child can carry, "You're my best thing, Daddy." And it was the only sentence in any language that made Marcus Delaney feel like he wasn't failing. That's who he was on November 14th, a tired man on a dark road, heading home to the only person who made the exhaustion worth it. His windshield wipers were slapping at moisture that wasn't quite rain and wasn't quite air. His headlights were cutting 2 weak yellow tunnels into a wall of white that refused to move. And his only thought, his only conscious, coherent thought, was whether Lily had fallen asleep on the couch again, or whether the babysitter had managed to get her into bed. He had no idea that in less than 3 minutes, everything was about to change. It started with a glow, not a bright one, not obvious, just a faint, rhythmic pulse of amber light, bleeding through the fog like a distress signal from a place that shouldn't exist. Marcus leaned forward, squinting through the windshield, his foot easing off the gas. The pulse was steady, on, off, the universal language of something wrong. He slowed to 15 miles an hour, then 10. The shape began to materialize in pieces, the way things do in heavy fog, not all at once, but in fragments that your brain has to assemble like a puzzle. First, the outline of a vehicle, then the angle, nose down, rear end, jutting upward at a sickening tilt. Then the markings, black and white. Official decals on the rear quarter panel. A light bar on the roof, shattered but partially visible. A police cruiser. In the ravine. On a road where no one should have been. Marcus pulled onto the gravel shoulder and killed his engine. The fog pressed against his windshield like something alive, something hungry, something that wanted to keep whatever had happened out here hidden. For a moment, and he would think about this moment for the rest of his life, he sat completely still. His mind did what minds do. It cycled through excuses with terrifying speed and shameful efficiency. Someone else will find her. Dispatch must already know. There are protocols for this. Trained people. People with equipment and knowledge and authority. You fix boat engines, Marcus. You're not qualified. You have no business being here. Lily is waiting. The babysitter is probably worried. Every minute you sit here is another minute you're not home. Another $12 you can't afford. Just go. Just drive. Someone else will stop. The excuses were rational, reasonable. They made perfect logical sense, every single one of them. But his hand was already on the door handle. He stepped out into the cold, and the fog swallowed him immediately. It tasted of salt and metal and something else, something sharp and chemical that he would later realize was the smell of radiator fluid mixing with blood. The silence was absolute. No wind, no traffic, no sirens. Just the soft rhythmic click of cooling metal and the faint hiss of steam from a ruptured engine, as though the night itself was holding its breath, waiting to see what he would do. He grabbed the flashlight from behind his seat, a heavy old maglite, the kind that doubles as a weapon, and moved toward the wreck. The cruiser had gone off the road with tremendous violence. Skid marks, two thick, desperate black scars, cut across the asphalt before vanishing over the edge of the shoulder and into the ravine. The front end was wrapped around the concrete drainage culvert like it had been placed there by a giant hand. The windshield was a mosaic of fractured glass, partially collapsed inward. Equipment from inside the cabin, a clipboard, a radio handset, shattered pieces of a laptop mount, had been thrown across the gravel in a debris field that told a story of sudden, catastrophic force. And then the flashlight beam found her. She was half ejected from the driver's side door, a door that had been wrenched open either by the impact or by her own desperate attempt to crawl free before her body gave out. She was face down in the gravel and wet grass, one arm twisted beneath her at an angle that made Marcus's stomach lurch and his vision narrow. Her duty belt had been partially torn away. A radio lay 5 feet from her outstretched hand, close enough to taunt, far enough to be useless. And beneath her torso, spreading outward in a slow, relentless tide, was blood. Dark, almost black in the flashlight beam. Fed by a wound he couldn't yet see but could already feel, the way you feel a storm approaching before a single drop of rain falls. Marcus dropped to his knees beside her. The gravel bit into his skin through his jeans. The cold from the wet ground seeped upward immediately, but he didn't notice. He couldn't notice. There was no room left for anything except the woman in front of him and the terrible question forming in his throat. "Hey, can you hear me? Hey!" Nothing. No response. No movement. Not even a twitch. He pressed 2 fingers against her neck, the way he'd seen it done in the annual first aid course the shipyard required all employees to take. A course he'd sat through half awake, thinking it would never matter, thinking he would never be in a situation where the difference between a pulse and no pulse was the difference between action and collapse. 1 second, nothing. 2 seconds, nothing. 3 seconds, and his own heart was slamming so hard against his ribs that he couldn't tell if what he felt was her pulse or the echo of his own terror. Then, faint, thready, so weak it was almost imaginary, a flutter beneath his fingertips. A whisper of life so quiet that the fog almost drowned it out. A pulse. She was alive. Barely, but alive. And in that moment, every excuse, every rational, reasonable argument for driving away collapsed into dust. Because Marcus Delaney was kneeling beside a dying woman on a road where no one else was coming, and the only thing standing between her and the darkness was him. His hands moved before his brain could issue instructions. He rolled her over, carefully, gently, one hand supporting her neck because some deep instinctive part of him understood that you don't move an injured person roughly even when everything inside you is screaming to hurry. The flashlight beam swept across her face, young, maybe early 30s, her features tied with a pain she wasn't conscious enough to express, and then down to her torso where the source of everything announced itself. A deep, ragged laceration across her left side, just below the ribs. Something, metal debris, shattered glass, a piece of the crumpled cruiser, had torn through her uniform and partially through the tactical vest beneath. It, opening a wound that was bleeding steadily, relentlessly, with the kind of quiet persistence that kills people before anyone notices they're dying. Marcus didn't hesitate. He ripped off his flannel overshirt, the one he'd worn to work that morning, already stained with engine grease and sweat, and pressed it against the wound. Hard. The fabric soaked through almost instantly, warmth flooding between his fingers with a speed that sent a spike of ice through his chest. Not enough. He pulled his undershirt over his head, a plain white cotton tee that was now the only barrier between his bare skin and the 40-degree air, balled it up, layered it over the saturated flannel, and pressed down with both hands. Harder this time. Hard enough that his arms shook. "Stay with me," he said. His voice cracked on the second word, split open by fear and adrenaline and the absolute crushing weight of what was happening. "You stay with me. You hear me? Don't you leave." He fumbled for his phone with one blood-slicked hand, trying to maintain pressure with the other, the screen smeared red when he touched it. His fingers were trembling so badly it took 3 attempts to unlock it and 2 more to dial 911. The call connected after 2 rings that felt like 2 centuries. "I need an ambulance," he said, and his voice sounded foreign to his own ears, too high, too fast, too desperate. "Highway 9, past the Barrow Point turnoff. I don't know the exact mile marker, maybe a quarter mile past. There's a police cruiser in the ravine. An officer is down. She's bleeding. She's bleeding badly. I'm applying pressure, but it's not. It keeps coming through. She's barely breathing. Please, please hurry." The dispatcher's voice was calm, professional, maddeningly measured. Help was being dispatched. An ambulance was en route. "Stay on the line. Continue applying pressure. Do not move her unnecessarily. Keep talking to her." "How long?" Marcus demanded. A pause. Then, estimated arrival, 12 to 14 minutes. 12 to 14 minutes. On this road. In this fog. With this much blood already on the ground. Marcus set the phone on speaker, placed it in the gravel beside his knee, and returned both hands to the wound. He pressed down with everything he had. His arms burned. His shoulders screamed. The cold was everywhere now, crawling up from the wet earth, wrapping around his bare torso, working its way into the spaces between his ribs. But the cold was a distant thing, a problem belonging to a version of himself that didn't exist anymore. The only thing that existed was the pressure of his hands and the faint failing rhythm of her breathing. He shifted his position, sliding one arm beneath her shoulders, lifting her upper body off the frozen ground and cradling her against his chest. Her head lolled against his collarbone. She was so still, so impossibly still, but he could feel her breathing, shallow, irregular, each exhale weaker than the last, and as long as he could feel that, he refused to stop. The fog wrapped around them both like a cocoon, sealing them inside a world that had shrunk to the space between his hands and her heartbeat. There was no highway, no shipyard, no unpaid bills or broken faucets or ex-wives who left without looking back. There was only this. 2 strangers in the dark, one bleeding, one holding on. And Marcus talked to her, not because the dispatcher told him to, not because he thought she could hear him, but because silence, in that moment, felt like surrender, and he was not going to surrender. He told her about Lily, about how Lily insisted on pouring her own orange juice every morning, even though she spilled it every single time, and then looked up at him with her mother's eyes and said, "I almost got it, Daddy." He told her about Pancake Fridays, how it had started as a distraction from heartbreak and turned into the most sacred tradition in their small, imperfect family. He told her about Captain Bun, the stuffed rabbit that had been stitched back together so many times it looked like a patchwork ghost, held together by thread and love and the stubborn refusal to throw away something that still mattered. He told her that Lily believed the fog wasn't really fog at all, that it was actually clouds that had gotten tired of being up so high and came down to rest for a while. "She says they just need a nap," Marcus whispered, his voice breaking. "And then they go back up." He told her about the sentence that kept him alive, the one Lily whispered into his chest on the nights when the weight of the world pressed down so hard he thought he might crack. "You're my best thing, Daddy." 4 words. The entire universe compressed into 4 words spoken by a 7-year-old who didn't know she was saving her father's life every time she said them. He told a stranger these things because they were true, and because truth is the only currency that matters when someone is slipping away. Then her breathing changed. It became shallow, stuttering. The pauses between inhales stretched longer, 3 seconds, then 4, then 5, and each one felt like standing on the edge of a cliff and waiting for the ground to disappear. Marcus felt her pulse weaken beneath his fingers. Not fade, weaken. A distinction that doesn't matter to most people but mattered to him in that moment more than anything had ever mattered in his life. "No," he said. Not a whisper, not a plea, a command. "No, you don't get to do this. You don't get to leave. Not here, not on this road, not while I'm holding you." He pressed harder. He talked louder. He thought about Lily, about what it would mean if he let go, if he gave up, if he chose the easy thing instead of the right thing. What would he tell her? How would he explain that he had held someone's life in his hands and let it slip through because he was tired, because he was afraid, because the fog was thick and the blood was warm and the night was so impossibly dark? He couldn't. He would never be able to. So he held on. He pressed down. He refused. And then, distant at first, so faint he thought he was imagining it, a sound, a high, thin wail cutting through the white, growing louder, growing closer, multiplying. Sirens, red and blue lights shredded the fog into fractured color, strobing, pulsing, turning the gray world into something electric and alive. 2 ambulances, 3 patrol cars, a fire rescue unit. The highway erupted into organized chaos as vehicles screeched onto the shoulder and doors flew open and boots hit gravel and voices, professional, urgent, alive, filled the silence that had almost swallowed him whole. Paramedics descended on the officer with swift, practiced hands. Marcus was pulled away, gently at first, then firmly when he didn't let go. Someone wrapped a thermal blanket around his bare shoulders. Someone else shone a penlight in his eyes. And Marcus Delaney, the man who had been holding a stranger's life together with nothing but 2 bare hands and a voice full of pancake stories, finally exhaled. If you're still watching right now, if your chest is tight and your throat is thick and you're pulling for this man with everything you have, then you already understand why this story matters. Hit that share button right now. Send this to someone who needs to be reminded that good people still exist in this world. And stay with me, because what happens next? What happens after the sirens and the rescue and the adrenaline fades? That's the part no one saw coming, not even Marcus. The rescue was over, but Marcus's ordeal was just beginning. The scene was controlled chaos. Paramedics worked on the officer with urgent, choreographed precision. IV lines, pressure bandages, a cervical collar, rapid assessments shouted in clipped medical shorthand that Marcus couldn't follow. A helicopter was being called in. The nearest trauma center was 40 minutes by road, and she didn't have 40 minutes. Marcus stood off to the side, wrapped in the silver thermal blanket, shivering so violently that his teeth chattered in a rhythm he couldn't stop. His hands were covered in blood that wasn't his own. It had dried in the creases of his knuckles, darkened beneath his fingernails, stained the waistband of his jeans where he'd wiped his palms without thinking. His bare chest, he'd given both shirts to a dying woman, was now covered only by the thin emergency blanket, and the cold had settled into him with a permanence that felt almost personal, as though the November night was punishing him for standing still too long. Officers moved around the scene with practiced efficiency, setting up flares, redirecting non-existent traffic, photographing the cruiser, documenting the debris field. Radios crackled with chatter he caught in fragments. Words like critical and airlifted and suspect still at large. Then a sergeant approached him, tall, broad-shouldered, a face carved from years of authority and sleepless nights and the particular kind of hardness that comes from seeing too much of the world's worst and not enough of its best. His nameplate read Dominguez. His eyes moved over Marcus with the clinical, unblinking assessment of a man trained to read crime scenes the way others read books. "You found her?" "Yes, sir." "Tell me what happened." "I was driving home from work. I saw the hazard lights through the fog. I pulled over. I found her beside the cruiser. She was bleeding. I applied pressure. I called 911. That's it." Did you see another vehicle? Anyone leaving the scene?" "No, no one. Just her." "What were you doing on this road at 1 a.m? "Driving home. I work at the Hargrove shipyard. My shift ran late." The sergeant studied him, and Marcus understood the look, understood it with a sickening clarity that settled in his stomach like a stone. He saw himself through the sergeant's eyes, a lone man, shirtless, covered in a police officer's blood, discovered at a remote crash site on an empty highway at 1 a.m. No witnesses, no corroboration, no immediately obvious reason for being there. He knew how it looked. "I just tried to help," Marcus said quietly. "That's all I did." They asked him to come to the precinct. They didn't use the word arrest. They didn't put him in handcuffs, but they didn't give him a choice either. A young officer drove him to the station in a patrol car, while another followed in Marcus's truck. Nobody spoke during the drive. At the precinct, they put him in a room. Not an interrogation room, not officially, but a room with a table and 2 chairs and a door that stayed closed and walls that pressed in closer with every passing minute. Someone brought him a borrowed jacket, a department windbreaker that smelled like stale coffee and institutional soap. He pulled it on and sat with his hands flat on the table, the blood still on them, drying and cracking like old paint. And he waited. His mind went to Lily. It always went to Lily. Was she awake? Had the babysitter called? Was she standing in the hallway in her pajamas, clutching Captain Bunn, wondering why her father wasn't home? He imagined her face. The confusion first, then the fear that she worked so hard to hide because she was 7 years old and already understood that showing fear meant admitting something might be wrong. The guilt hit him like a physical blow. He should be there. He should be home. He should be tucking her in, smoothing her hair, telling her the world was safe even when he wasn't sure it was. Instead, he was sitting in a police station with another person's blood on his hands, wondering if anyone would believe him. He had saved a stranger's life. And now he sat under fluorescent lights, treated like a question mark. Then the door opened. A detective walked in, different from the sergeant, older. A woman with silver at her temples and reading glasses pushed up on her forehead and an expression on her face that Marcus couldn't immediately read. She sat down across from him, set a folder on the table, and studied him for a long moment before speaking. "Mr. Delaney." "Yes, ma'am." "We've reviewed the traffic camera footage from the intersection at Barrow Point. We've also received an update from the hospital." She paused, opened the folder, closed it again without looking at it, as though the information inside was already memorized. "Everything you told Sergeant Dominguez checks out, completely." Marcus didn't move. "The officer's name is Natalie Voss," the detective continued. "She's in emergency surgery right now. The trauma surgeon has provided a preliminary assessment." Another pause, longer this time, weighted with something that Marcus could feel but couldn't name. He said that based on the nature and location of her injuries, she would have died within 20 minutes of the initial trauma. She had been bleeding for approximately 12 minutes when you found her. The math hung in the air between them. If you had arrived 8 minutes later, 8 minutes, Mr. Delaney, Officer Voss would not have survived. 8 minutes. That was the margin between a funeral and a future, between a folded flag presented to grieving parents and a woman opening her eyes in a hospital bed, between a name etched into a memorial wall and a life that still had chapters left to write. 8 minutes. And a man who refused to drive past. The detective stood. She extended her hand across the table. Marcus looked at it, looked at his own hands, still darkened with dried blood, and took it. "Thank you," she said. And the way she said it, low, rough, almost private, told him everything that the official language of police procedure never could. They had questioned him as a suspect. They released him as something else entirely. Marcus drove home in the pale gray light of early dawn. The fog was thinning. The road was still empty. He pulled into his driveway, turned off the engine, and sat for 2 full minutes before going inside. The babysitter was dozing in the recliner. Lily was asleep on the couch, Captain Bunn wedged under her chin, one sock on and one sock off, the television playing a cartoon she'd stopped watching hours ago. He carried her to bed, tucked the blanket around her shoulders, placed Captain Bunn in the crook of her arm. Then he sat down on the floor beside her bed, his back against the wall, his ruined hands resting in his lap. He didn't cry, he just breathed. And for the first time in hours, breathing felt like enough. Her name was Natalie Voss, and she was never supposed to be on Highway 9 that night. 2 days after the rescue, Detective Ruiz, a calm, deliberate investigator with kind eyes and a habit of choosing his words the way a surgeon chooses instruments, visited Marcus at his home. Not to interrogate, not to inform officially, but to tell him what had actually happened on that fog-covered stretch of road, because Marcus deserved to know. Natalie Voss was a 6-year veteran of the Crestline Police Department, Patrol Division, known throughout the precinct as the officer who took the calls others avoided, who drove the routes others wouldn't, who showed up first and left last and never, not once, complained about any of it. She was respected, she was trusted, and she was quietly, fiercely devoted to the job in a way that her colleagues admired and sometimes worried about, because devotion that deep has a way of putting you in places where the world can hurt you. That night, Natalie had been running a routine patrol along the coastal corridor when a dispatch alert came through. A stolen vehicle, a dark-colored sedan, had been positively linked to a string of armed robberies targeting small businesses along the coast. 3 businesses in 2 weeks. A convenience store clerk pistol-whipped during the last one. The suspect was considered armed and dangerous, and the vehicle had been spotted heading north on Highway 9 toward a residential area. Natalie called for backup. The nearest available unit was 20 minutes out. 20 minutes. In 20 minutes, that vehicle would reach the neighborhoods on the north end, the quiet streets with porch lights and parked bicycles and families sleeping behind unlocked doors. She made the call to follow, alone, unauthorized, dangerous, and necessary. She caught up to the sedan near mile marker 47. The fog was already thick, visibility collapsing by the minute. She activated her lights. The sedan didn't stop. The pursuit, if you could call it that in fog so dense you could barely see the taillights of the car you were chasing, lasted less than 3 minutes. Then the suspect did something deliberate, something calculated, something that the accident reconstruction team would later describe with clinical precision, but which, stripped of its technical language, amounted to this. He slammed his brakes on the fog-blind curve, knowing exactly what would happen to the cruiser behind him. Natalie hit the brakes. The cruiser's tires locked on the wet pavement. The car slid, laterally, sickeningly, off the road and into the drainage ravine at nearly 50 miles per hour. The front end struck the concrete culvert with enough force to collapse the engine compartment, shatter the windshield, and send shrapnel, twisted metal, broken glass, fragments of the dashboard, tearing through the cabin. A piece of that shrapnel, a jagged strip of metal from the A-pillar, tore through Natalie's uniform, partially bypassed her vest at the lower edge, and opened a deep laceration across her left side. It nicked her spleen. It opened a blood vessel that, once opened, would not stop on its own. The suspect fled on foot into the tree line. He was apprehended 2 days later at a bus station 60 miles to the north, but that was someone else's story. Natalie's story was the ravine, the fog, the blood, the radio that had been thrown 5 feet from her outstretched hand, close enough to taunt, far enough to be useless. The 12 minutes she lay in the gravel, alone, bleeding, her body temperature dropping, her consciousness flickering like a candle in a drafty room, until a pair of headlights appeared through the fog, until a man who fixed boat engines knelt beside her in the mud, until 2 bare hands pressed against the wound that was stealing her life, and a voice, rough, breaking, impossibly kind, told her about a little girl who believed clouds came down to rest. Detective Ruiz shared all of this while sitting on Marcus's second-hand couch, holding a cup of coffee that Lily had insisted on pouring herself, carefully, with both hands, her tongue poking out in concentration the way it always did when she was doing something she considered important. She stood nearby, watching the detective with wide, curious eyes, sensing the gravity of the conversation even if the words were too big and the details too heavy for her 7-year-old shoulders. When Ruiz finished, he looked at Marcus, at this unremarkable man in a borrowed department windbreaker, sitting in a rented house with a dripping faucet and crayon drawings taped to the refrigerator, and said simply, "She's alive because of you. The surgeon was very clear about that. 8 minutes, Mr. Delaney, that's what it came down to. You gave her those 8 minutes. Marcus didn't say anything. He looked down at his hands, still bearing faint traces of grease in the creases, the nails trimmed short and uneven, and nodded once. Lily broke the silence the way children do, effortlessly, instinctively, without knowing she was doing it. "Your dad's a brave man," Ruiz told her as he stood to leave. Lily looked at Marcus, at his tired eyes, at his bandaged hands, at the way he sat slightly hunched, as though carrying something invisible on his shoulders that was too heavy to put down. "I know," she said. 2 words, spoken with absolute certainty, and they landed in the room with more weight than anything the detective had said. Natalie Voss spent 11 days in the hospital. 4 surgeries, 2 blood transfusions, a collapsed lung that required a chest tube, a procedure that, when she was conscious enough to understand what it involved, made her grip the bedrail so hard her knuckles went white. The laceration had done damage that would take months to fully repair. Internal sutures, wound care, physical therapy, a recovery timeline that stretched out ahead of her like a road she couldn't see the end of. The department rallied around her the way departments do when one of their own goes down. Flowers filled her room until it looked like a florist shop. Cards arrived in stacks, from fellow officers, from dispatchers, from the woman who ran the coffee cart outside the precinct, and who had never once charged Natalie for a latte because cops who worked doubles shouldn't have to pay for caffeine. A rotating schedule was organized so that someone, always someone, sat beside her bed at all hours, ensuring she would never open her eyes to an empty room. But every time Natalie woke, groggy, confused, pain medication blurring the edges of the world, she didn't ask about the case. She didn't ask about the suspect. She didn't ask about her prognosis or her vehicle or the departmental review that would inevitably follow an unauthorized pursuit. She asked about the voice, because that's what she remembered, not events, not a sequence of actions that could be written in a report and filed in a cabinet. She remembered sensations, fragments of a world she had nearly left, preserved in her memory like shards of glass from a broken window, each one catching light from a different angle. The pressure of hands against her side, firm, unyielding, the kind of pressure that hurts but also means someone is fighting for you. The warmth of a body against her back, pulling her off frozen ground. A heartbeat that wasn't hers, steady beneath her ear, anchoring her to a world she was drifting away from. And the voice, steady and breaking at the same time. How was that possible? How could a voice be both of those things? Telling her things she couldn't fully hear but could somehow feel. A story about a little girl, about pancakes, about a stuffed rabbit stitched together so many times it looked like a patchwork ghost, about clouds that came down to rest because they were tired of being up so high, and a sentence, half heard, half imagined, spoken with a tenderness that had no business existing in a drainage ravine at 1 a.m, something about being someone's best thing. These fragments haunted her, not as trauma, not in the way that nightmares haunt, sharp and violent and unwanted. They haunted her the way a melody haunts, persistent, gentle, returning without invitation, carrying with them a warmth that she couldn't explain and didn't want to lose. "Find him," she told her captain, a woman named Adrienne Morales, who had led the department for 12 years and who sat beside Natalie's bed on the 4th day with a composure that almost hid the fact that she'd been crying in the hallway 20 minutes earlier. "Please, I need to find the man who stayed with me." Captain Morales told her his name, Marcus Delaney. She told her what he did for a living, shipyard mechanic, diesel engines, commercial vessels. She told her where he lived, a rented 2-bedroom in Crestline, 14 miles from the ravine where he'd knelt in the mud and held her life together. She told her he had a 7-year-old daughter named Lily, who poured coffee for detectives with both hands and kept her father's lunch notes in a shoebox under her bed. And she told her that he had refused every single interview request from local media, that reporters had knocked on his door and he had said only, "I just stopped. Anyone would have." And then he'd closed the door. Natalie stared at the ceiling for a long time after Captain Morales left. The fluorescent lights hummed, the monitors beeped, the 4 dripped, and she thought about what Marcus had said. Anyone would have, and she shook her head slowly against the pillow. "No," she whispered to the empty room. "Not anyone." She'd been a cop for 6 years. She knew what people drive past. I want you to pause for just a moment right now. Just one moment. Drop a single word in the comments, one word that describes how this story is making you feel. I read every single comment, and your words, your reactions, your honesty, that's what reminds me why these stories need to be told. Now, the moment you've been waiting for, the first time Marcus and Natalie truly met, both conscious, both standing, both breathing, because of a choice made in the fog. 5 weeks after the accident, on a Saturday morning in late December, Natalie Voss drove to Marcus Delaney's home. She had been released from the hospital, but was far from healed. A compression wrap bound her left side beneath a civilian sweater. Movement was slow, deliberate, negotiated with a body that was still learning to trust itself again. She drove with one hand, the other resting protectively against her ribs, wincing at every pothole and speed bump. She almost turned around twice. Once at the freeway exit, where the rational part of her brain pointed out that she could write a letter, send flowers, make a phone call, any of the distant, controlled methods of expressing gratitude that didn't require standing in front of a stranger and trying to articulate what it feels like to be given back your own life. And once at the end of his street, where she sat in her parked car for 4 minutes, hands on the steering wheel, rehearsing sentences that all sounded wrong. "Thank you for saving me. Too small. I owe you my life. Too dramatic. I heard your voice in the dark, and it kept me here. Too intimate. Too honest. Too much for a first meeting between two people whose only shared experience was 11 minutes in a drainage ravine and a fog that wouldn't lift. She knocked on the door anyway, because some things are bigger than comfort, and because the man on the other side of that door had knelt in the mud 1 a.m. for a woman he'd never met, and if he could do that, she could do this. The door opened. He was taller than she'd imagined, broader in the shoulders. His eyes, dark, quiet, impossibly gentle, held a warmth that seemed completely at odds with his rough hands and work-worn frame. He was wearing a flannel shirt, a new one, she noticed, because the old one was probably still in an evidence bag somewhere, soaked through with her blood, and his hair was slightly damp, as though he'd just come from the shower. He looked at her, and she watched the recognition move across his face, not the recognition of a face he'd seen before, because he hadn't, not really, not in any way that counted. He'd seen her bloodied and broken and unconscious in the dark. He'd never seen her standing, never seen her breathing on her own, never seen the life in her eyes that his hands had fought to keep there. But he knew her. Somehow, in a place deeper than memory, he knew her. "Officer Voss," he said. "Natalie," she corrected softly, and her voice nearly gave out on the second syllable. "Marcus." They stood in the doorway, two people on opposite sides of a threshold that was also a river, connected by a bridge that neither of them had built but both of them had crossed. The December air moved between them, carrying the scent of pine trees and coffee and something baking in the kitchen, and for a moment neither of them spoke, because some silences hold more truth than any sentence ever could. Then a small face appeared behind Marcus's left leg. Lily peered up at Natalie with the unapologetic, unflinching curiosity that only a 7-year-old can carry, equal parts suspicion and wonder, as though every new adult was a puzzle that needed solving immediately. "Are you the lady my daddy saved?" The question was so direct, so unadorned, so completely free of the careful hedging and emotional management that adults wrap around everything, that it cut straight through every rehearsed sentence Natalie had prepared and went directly to the place where she was most vulnerable. Her composure broke. She knelt down, slowly, wincing as the movement pulled at sutures that were still healing, and met Lily's eyes at her own level. Dark eyes. Her father's eyes. "Yes, sweetheart," she said, and her voice was thick now, carrying everything she hadn't been able to say to the man standing above her. "He saved me." Lily considered this with the gravity of a Supreme Court justice weighing evidence. Then she nodded, apparently satisfied. "He's good at fixing things," she said, matter-of-factly. "He fixed my rabbit 7 times. And Natalie laughed. It came out of nowhere, a sound so unexpected, so unguarded, so completely involuntary that it surprised her more than anyone. It was the first real laugh she'd managed since waking up in the ICU. The first time her body had produced a sound that wasn't a groan or a gasp or the controlled breathing of a woman managing pain. It was messy and rough and slightly too loud, and it hurt her ribs, and she didn't care. Because Lily Delaney had just compared her life to a stuffed rabbit, and somehow, impossibly, that was the most perfect thing anyone had said to her in 5 weeks. The laughter dissolved whatever tension remained. Marcus stepped aside, invited her in, put coffee on, and for the next 2 hours, they sat in his small kitchen, Natalie on a chair with a cushion Marcus silently added because he noticed her wincing, Lily cross-legged on the counter because she refused to sit at the table when there were guests, and they talked about ordinary things. Lily's school, the shipyard, Natalie's physical therapy, the fog that still rolled in most mornings and burned off by noon. They talked about the coffee, which was mediocre and which Lily had insisted on helping with, and which therefore contained approximately twice the recommended amount of grounds. They talked about Captain Bunn's most recent surgical procedure, a torn ear reattached with dental floss because Marcus couldn't find the sewing kit, and Lily's insistence that the rabbit was basically bionic now. They did not talk about the ravine. They did not talk about the blood, or the fog, or the 11 minutes, or the 8-minute margin that separated one version of Natalie's life from another. They didn't need to. It lived between them already. A shared chapter written in a language that didn't require rereading because it had been written on their bodies, in the scar. Tissue beneath Natalie's ribs and the fading bruises on Marcus's knees and the muscle memory of hands that had pressed down and held on and refused to let go. When Natalie left that afternoon, she made it as far as her car before the tears came. She sat behind the steering wheel for 10 minutes, engine off, hands trembling, and she cried. Not from pain. The physical pain was manageable now, controlled by medication and willpower and the stubborn refusal to let a wound define her. Not from gratitude alone, though the gratitude was so large it felt like it might swallow her whole. She cried because of what Marcus Delaney represented. She cried because she had spent 6 years policing the worst of human behavior, the robberies, the assaults, the DUIs, the domestic calls at 3 a.m. where everyone was bleeding and no one was telling the truth, and she had started, without realizing it, to lose faith. Not in the job, not in the badge, but in people, in the fundamental, irreducible goodness of the average human being. And then a tired man on a dark road, a man with grease in his palms and a daughter at home and every reason in the world to keep driving, had stopped. He had knelt in the mud. He had pressed his bare hands against a stranger's wound. He had talked about pancakes and rabbits and clouds that needed naps, and he had held her life together until the sirens came. She cried because goodness still existed, and she had almost stopped believing it did. The story didn't end with a reunion. In some ways, it was only beginning. Captain Adrienne Morales had led the Crestline Police Department for 12 years. She had navigated budget cuts, staffing shortages, public scrutiny, internal affairs investigations, and the quiet, corrosive exhaustion that comes from leading people who run toward danger while the rest of the world runs away. She was tough. She was pragmatic. She did not make emotional decisions. But what Marcus Delaney did on Highway 9 moved her in a way she did not expect and could not ignore. 3 weeks after Natalie's release from the hospital, Captain Morales made a decision that surprised her entire command staff. She invited Marcus to address the next department-wide briefing, not as a guest speaker, not as a public relations opportunity, not as a civilian award recipient standing awkwardly beside a podium while someone read a citation he didn't write. She invited him as a witness to what service, real service, stripped of badges and authority and the institutional weight of a uniform, actually looks like from the other side. Marcus almost said no. Public speaking terrified him. The thought of standing in front of 140 uniformed officers and opening his mouth made his palms sweat and his stomach drop in a way that kneeling beside a bleeding woman in the fog never had. Fear is strange that way. It doesn't follow logic, doesn't rank threats in order of severity, doesn't care that you've already survived the harder thing. He was going to decline. He had the words ready. "I appreciate it, ma'am, but I'm not the talking type." Then Lily found out. She overheard him on the phone. She was always overhearing things, a side effect of living in a 2-bedroom house with thin walls and a father who forgot to lower his voice, and she appeared in the kitchen doorway with Captain Bunn dangling from one hand and an expression on her face that Marcus recognized immediately. The expression that meant she had formed an opinion and was about to deliver it regardless of whether it had been requested. "Daddy, you should go tell them." She said it with the same grave, unshakable seriousness she'd had at 4 years old, standing in this same kitchen, asking for pancakes on the worst night of their lives. And just like that night, Marcus couldn't refuse her. He never could. He stood in front of 140 officers on a Tuesday morning in January, wearing a borrowed button-down shirt that was slightly too tight in the shoulders and dress shoes that pinched because he hadn't worn them in 3 years. His hands were at his sides. He had no notes. He had no speech prepared because every version he'd tried to write the night before had come out sounding like someone else, someone polished, someone articulate, someone who wasn't him. So he just talked, the way he'd talked in the fog, unscripted, unpolished, real. He talked for less than 4 minutes, and in those 4 minutes, he didn't mention heroism. He didn't mention bravery. He didn't mention the blood on his hands or the cold in his bones or the 8-minute margin that haunted him in quiet moments. He talked about Lily. He talked about Pancake Fridays, about Captain Bunn, Bionic Rabbit, about a 7-year-old girl who believed clouds came down to rest when they were tired. He talked about the moment he knelt in that gravel and realized, really realized, in the bone-deep way that changes you permanently, that the woman bleeding in front of him was someone's daughter too, someone's partner, someone's friend, someone who had driven into the fog alone because there were families sleeping on the other side of it, and she had decided that their safety mattered more than her own. "I didn't save a police officer," he said, and his voice was rough and unsteady and completely, authentically his own. "I just refused to leave a person alone in the dark. That's not courage. That's not heroism. That's just being human. And I think maybe we forget how to do that sometimes, all of us. I think maybe we drive past things because it's easier, because stopping is scary and messy, and it might cost us something we're not ready to give. But easy doesn't keep people alive. Easy doesn't hold someone's hand in the rain. Easy doesn't get you a daughter who looks at you like you matter." He paused, swallowed. His eyes were bright but steady. "I think the reason I stopped that night, the real reason, is because I knew that if I didn't, I would have to go home and look at my little girl, and I would have to know that her dad was the kind of man who keeps driving, and I couldn't live with that. I just couldn't." He stopped talking. The room was silent, not the polite silence of an audience waiting to clap. The deep, heavy cathedral silence of 140 people sitting with something they didn't expect to feel. 3 seconds passed. 5. Then Captain Morales, seated in the front row, began to clap. Slowly, deliberately. The way you clap when the sound isn't applause but acknowledgement, recognition of something true that you needed to hear but didn't know until you heard it. The sound spread. 1 officer, then 5, then 20, then every person in the room, 140 men and women in uniform, standing, clapping for a man who fixed boat engines and packed school lunches and had never once in his entire life considered himself remarkable. Marcus stood at that podium with his too-tight shirt and his pinching shoes, and he felt something shift inside his chest. Not pride exactly. Something quieter than pride. Something closer to the feeling he got when Lily crawled into his lap and whispered, "You're my best thing, Daddy." The feeling of being enough. The rare, precious, almost unbearable feeling of being exactly enough. In the weeks that followed, the department changed, not dramatically. No sweeping policy overhauls or organizational restructuring. But Captain Morales established a community recognition program, not because anyone told her to, but because Marcus Delaney had reminded her of something she'd been too busy managing a department to remember, that the people behind the badges and the people in front of them are the same, that they bleed the same, grieve the same, hope the same. Training sessions began to include his story, not as a case study, as a reminder that courage doesn't always wear a uniform. That the people they served were not abstractions or statistics or incident numbers in a database. They were fathers driving home in the fog. They were little girls asleep on couches. They were hands pressing against wounds in the dark, holding on, because letting go wasn't something they could live with. Officers began stopping by Marcus's home, not for headlines or photo ops, just to shake his hand, to meet the man, to sit in his kitchen and drink the mediocre coffee and watch Lily demonstrate Captain Bunn's latest bionic upgrade. She watched them from the doorway sometimes, confused by the attention but proud of her father in a way she couldn't articulate, a pride that lived not in her words but in the way she stood a little taller when she saw the patrol cars in the driveway. 3 months after the accident, Officer Natalie Voss returned to full duty. The day she walked back into the precinct, the hallways filled with applause. Officers she'd trained with, dispatchers who'd talked her through dark nights, the woman from the coffee cart who handed her a latte and said, "This one's free too, forever." Natalie smiled. She shook hands. She accepted the welcome with the composed grace of a woman who had spent 11 days in a hospital bed practicing the art of holding herself together. But that night, her first night back on patrol, she did something nobody expected. She drove Highway 9. Not because she had to. Her assigned route was different. But she requested the coastal corridor, and her sergeant, who understood without asking, approved it without comment. She drove slowly. Mile marker by mile marker, the cruiser's headlights cutting through a night that was clear for once. No fog, no rain, just cold stars and dark water, and a road that stretched ahead in sharp, unobstructed lines. She pulled over at the spot. She didn't need a marker to find it. Her body knew. The scar tissue beneath her ribs pulled when she stepped out of the cruiser, a phantom ache that she understood would never fully leave, and she stood in the exact place where Marcus had knelt. The culvert had been repaired. New concrete, clean and pale against the dark earth. The skid marks on the asphalt had faded to faint gray traces that would disappear entirely by spring. There was nothing left, no plaque, no memorial, no indication that a life had nearly ended here and been pulled back from the edge by a stranger's stubborn, irrational, beautiful refusal to look away. But Natalie didn't need a marker. She carried the memory in her body, in the scar tissue that would silver over time but never vanish, in the phantom warmth of arms that had pulled her off frozen ground, in the echo of a voice that had told her, in the darkest moment of her life, about a little girl who believed clouds came down to rest when they were tired. She stood there for 2 minutes. She breathed. She let the night hold her, and then she got back in her cruiser, adjusted her mirror, and drove forward, not away from anything, toward everything. Across town, in a small kitchen in a rented 2-bedroom house with a dripping faucet and drafty windows in a backyard just big enough for a 7-year-old to run in circles, Marcus Delaney stood at the stove flipping pancakes. It was Friday. Lily sat at the kitchen table, legs swinging because her feet didn't reach the floor, reading aloud from a school assignment about community helpers. She read slowly, carefully, sounding out the big words with the determined concentration of a child who takes every task seriously, regardless of its size. Taped to the refrigerator behind Marcus, between a grocery list he'd forgotten to take shopping and a dentist appointment reminder he'd forgotten to cancel, was a photograph. It showed Marcus in a borrowed button-down shirt, shaking Captain Morales's hand in front of 140 officers, looking simultaneously terrified and proud. His eyes were wide. His posture was stiff. He looked exactly like a man who fixed boat engines for a living and had somehow ended up standing in front of a room full of cops being applauded for something he still didn't think was extraordinary. Beside the photograph, held in place by a magnet shaped like a starfish, was a crayon drawing. Lily had made it 3 weeks ago, during art time at school. The assignment was someone I admire. The drawing showed a stick figure man kneeling beside a stick figure woman on a road made of brown crayon, surrounded by wobbly circles of blue and red that were clearly meant to be emergency lights. Rain fell in straight blue lines from a gray sky, and beneath the scene, in letters that wobbled and leaned and occasionally reversed themselves, was a caption, "My daddy helps people." Marcus looked at the drawing every morning. He looked at it now, over his shoulder, spatula in hand, pancake bubbling on the griddle. He looked at the photograph next to it. He looked at Lily, sitting at the table with her assignment and her swinging legs and her mother's dark eyes. He hadn't saved the world. He hadn't changed the law. He hadn't done anything that would appear in a textbook or be studied in a lecture hall or be remembered by anyone outside a small coastal town where the fog rolled in most mornings and burned off by noon. He had simply stopped his truck on a dark road because something inside him, something deeper than fear, older than exhaustion, stronger than every excuse the darkness offered, had whispered a single undeniable truth. She needs you. Stay. And he had stayed. That was the whole story. That was everything. A man who stayed. Lily looked up from her paper. Her expression shifted, from concentration to warmth to the uncomplicated, total devastating love that only a child can give. "Daddy." "Yeah, sweetheart. Can we have extra syrup tonight?" Marcus laughed. It was the kind of laugh that starts somewhere deep in the chest and travels upward and outward until it fills an entire kitchen, an entire house, an entire life. The kind of laugh that carries within it every hard night and every early morning and every paycheck stretched too thin and every moment of doubt that whispered you're not enough, and answers all of them at once, with a single defiant, joyful sound. "Yeah, Lily," he said. "We can have extra syrup tonight." He set another pancake on her plate. She poured the syrup herself, too much, as always, a golden river flooding the plate and pooling around the edges, and grinned at him with sticky lips. Outside, the night was clear. No fog, no rain. The road stretched ahead through the darkness, empty and open, its curves visible for the first time in weeks. The stars were out, faint but present, scattered across a sky that had finally, after days of white, remembered how to be itself. Somewhere on that road, a cruiser moved through the dark, its driver healed, its lights steady, its purpose restored. And somewhere in a small kitchen, a man and his daughter ate pancakes with too much syrup and laughed about nothing important and held, without knowing it, the kind of love that doesn't make headlines but holds the entire world together. Heroes don't always carry badges. Sometimes they carry flashlights and flannel shirts in the quiet, unshakable belief that no one should ever have to die alone in the dark. Sometimes they're just ordinary people, tired people, struggling people, people who aren't sure they're enough, who stop when everyone else keeps driving. And in doing so, they remind the rest of us what it truly means to be human. If this story moved you, if it made you believe even for a single moment that one person's choice can change everything, then I'm asking you to do something right now. Like this video, share it with someone who needs to hear it, someone who's forgotten how much they matter, someone who's wondering if goodness still exists, someone who needs to be reminded that the world is still full of people who stop. Subscribe to this channel so you never miss a story like this one. And leave me a comment. Tell me honestly, would you have stopped that night? I'll see you in the next one.